Like to call the meeting to order. If we could please call the roll.
Mrs. McLean?
Here.
Ms. Seward?
Here.
Mr. Valentine?
Here.
Mrs. De Silva?
Here.
And Mrs. Messick?
Here. Mr. Valentine, if you would so kindly lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Motion to approve tonight's agenda. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Valentine. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. McLean. Please call the roll.
Mr. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. McLean?
Yes.
Ms. Seward?
Yes.
Mrs. De Silva?
Yes.
And Mrs. Messick?
Yes. Human Resources.
Good evening, members of the board. On tonight's agenda, we have a few recommendations for you under administrators. So we've been busy hiring, and the first one we have is for Rebecca Furby, and we're recommending Ms. Furby to be the coordinator of student services. She'll replace Kim Jude, who left Mr. Andres' department to be the chief of specialized learning at the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. Ms. Furby comes to us from Centerville City Schools, and so she's on tonight for your approval. We also have Mr. Perrell, who is currently the principal across the street at Dublin Kaufman High School. He's being recommended to take the place left by Mike Allring, who is moving on to another position in another district. And then lastly, Monica Woodson. She had been in Dublin City Schools previously as Monica Campana. We're recommending her to be the elementary principal of Depp Elementary starting next school year. So those three are on for your approval tonight, and then we also have two resignations that occurred since our last meeting last Monday night.
It is recommended by the superintendent that the Board of Education approve the certified personnel. Item 3A. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. De Silva. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. Seward. Please call the roll.
Mrs. De Silva?
Yes.
Ms. Seward?
Yes.
Mrs. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Valentine?
Yes.
And Mrs. Messick?
Yes, motion passes 5-0. Now on to the presentations from Planning Next and Fallon Research.
As we begin tonight, members of the board and members of our Dublin community, I'd like to begin by clarifying my remarks regarding communication strategies that I made at an earlier board meeting. When navigating a process as complex as redistricting, personal dialogue is far more effective than threaded emails. Emails often lead to misinterpretation and a lag in communication. By meeting in person with members of the board, Mr. Kern and I can provide clarity through direct dialogue. Last week, we met individually with board members to discuss redistricting and budget issues. I've also had multiple strategy conversations with Mrs. Messick and Mrs. De Silva as president and vice president. I want to be clear. These meetings are not an attempt to circumvent public records laws. These laws are really critical for effective collaborative team leadership. Individual meetings and intentional phone calls have been part of this district's working communication strategy for many years. And I apologize if my flippant comments at an earlier board meeting created confusion or anxiety. Secondly, as the Board of Education CEO, one of my primary responsibilities is the implementation of board policy. While Policy 5120 authorizes me to assign students to buildings, it became clear in October that a decision as critical as high school redistricting, this community and this board desire for the board to hold the ultimate decision-making authority. Consequently, as the superintendent, I will not change attendance boundaries in Dublin without a formal recommendation and resolution from the Board of Education with specific criteria and the priorities of those criteria. The decision for redistricting rests with the 5 board members. For over a decade, this community has planned for the expansion of Dublin-Scioto High School. With that 60,000 square foot addition now nearing completion, it is essential that we reassign students to Scioto to provide relief for the increasing enrollment at Dublin-Jerome High School. Tonight, we will hear from 2 highly respected firms, Planning Next and Fallon Research. They have been tasked with testing the criteria that was developed by the board at February's work session. By gathering both qualitative and quantitative data with a margin of error of less than 5%, this board will have accurate information necessary to begin your decision-making process. We recognize there is no easy solution and no data point that will receive universal support from our community. This process is difficult and will put neighborhoods at odds. However, our goal must remain simple. We must use the facilities that our community has funded and balance our high school populations. I will rely on our board's leadership to provide me and our administrative team with clear criteria and priorities to make this process work. At this time, I would like to invite our partners from Planning Next to share their findings from our recent focus groups.
Great. Okay. Good evening. I'm Sarah Bondrone. I'm a director with Planning Next. And over the first 2 weeks of March, my colleague Bailey and I conducted 24 focus groups out in the community. So I'm going to share what we heard tonight from those groups. Before I get going, though, I do have a couple reminder or review slides. When we were together in the February retreat, we had a few kind of level set slides. So I am going to hit those again just as a reminder before I get into the focus group summary. So we understand here the purpose is to provide direction to the administration for redistricting the high school population by the 27-28 school year in the form of criteria. A lot of this was just covered by John there. We are sticking to the factors within the board policy 5120, which we'll review in a second. I think it's important, point 3, the initial draft considerations that we tested with the community via the focus groups and survey is what we're going to be sharing out tonight. And then we're hoping this input is helpful to you as you think about refining that criteria and providing direction back. And again, the goal is to get to that balanced student population across all the high schools. Okay, so some of the realities that we're working within this dynamic region. Central Ohio is anticipated to continue to grow and be a dynamic growing place. Dublin is anticipated to continue to be a community of choice, driven in part by the high quality schools. And the city's development pattern over time creates the conditions and drives the need for redistricting to balance that enrollment. And we know this is hard because when it comes to addressing population growth, school policy follows or reacts to multiple local governments. So this is tough, as John said, and likely hard conversations or hard decisions are going to be difficult to avoid, but we must, again, keep that high-level perspective about what's best for the district moving forward. Again, reminder of the board policy 5120. Again, the factors there, A through F, are the ones that we have been working within in order to provide that feedback. So again, student enrollment and building capacity, considerations of safe student transportation and travel, the convenience of access to schools, the financial administration efficiency, and the effectiveness of the instructional program. And then F is sort of a catch-all category there. There are some legal guardrails as well. The following bulleted list are things that cannot be used in the redistricting process. And again, they're listed there as a reminder that these will not be used in any of the redistricting. Any questions from the board before I move into process and input feedback? Process overview, again, we're entering into the phase 2 of this work after our presentation here at the end of March. In mid-April, we are planning a community-wide engagement opportunity. We're still sort of designing that, but that'll be an opportunity for the community, anyone to provide feedback. And then going into later, reporting back to the board later, I think to be determined on that date, but maybe in May or June, come back to the board once we have that input from the larger community. And then moving into, by fall, having that map process finished. Oh, yeah, sorry, this is backwards. This is what we just came through, and now we're going into phase 2. Okay, so I'm going to move into the focus group summary now. And I first wanted to just share, these are the 24 groups that we talked to. Some of them are groups that the district pulls together every so often when they need to kind of, reach out and test ideas or get feedback from the community. So you can see things like the Business Advisory Council, the Senior Advisory Council. There's a number of staff groups. And then we had feeder parents to each of the high school. We had a student group, the Superintendent Student Advisory Council. They were probably my favorite group. They were so thoughtful and took it really seriously and were really, gave really good, logical input into a very complex issue. And then you can see there we had 6 what we're calling community cross-section representative groups, which we're really just trying to get a good cross-section of the community to come and share their thoughts. And we had over 150 folks participate across all of those focus groups meetings. So the agenda for the focus groups, we started out with some background slides, the very same ones I just presented that shared some background about the board policy 5120, shared the backgrounds of that reality slide so that people maybe appreciated the context by which we're doing this work. We also shared a slide about why the school district needed to redistrict, again, some of the same thoughts that John shared about the addition to SIOTA, just to give a good level set to anyone who might be coming into the conversations, maybe not as tuned in. We then shared 5 considerations, what we were calling considerations, and we posed them as sort of this or that, or A or B, which I'm going to go through that in a second. And then we had time for them to share their feedback, both in choices and then also in a kind of an overall prioritization exercise. And then we had a conclusion and next steps at the end. So again, for the facilitation of the focus groups, we presented those 5 considerations as choices because there are hard choices to make here, and so some of the you can't have it all kind of thing is true. So we were trying to illustrate different options that the community, the district could take, that the community could provide feedback to. So the way I walked through the groups, I previewed all the 5 considerations first. Then we went back through and what I call unpacked each of those considerations. So went into a little bit more detail. I'm going to unpack those for you as well, the same way I did for the focus groups tonight. But that allowed us to answer any questions, make sure everybody understood. Again, it's a very complex conversation, so I want to make sure everyone understood what we were getting at. If they had any questions, they could ask questions. We had a little time for that. And then we went through like a third time and received their feedback using the sort of choice the choices. We also had, because these are focus groups, we can do some qualitative input gathering as well. It's a little different than a survey. And so we were able to get some additional comments for each of the choices that they made. So if they chose whichever option they chose, they could provide us with some more insight on why they felt that was the best for the district. And then finally, after we went through each of those 5, we then did a prioritization exercise where we asked them to really think through all of the options they were just asked to sort of choose between, to really put them all in a list and say what's most important, what do you think best situates the district for continued success. And then we also asked sort of the bottom, what's least important or what might be able to come off the list or maybe isn't as important as other ones to you. So we did that sort of bookend exercise at the end. Okay, so I'm going to walk through each of the considerations for the board here so you understand how we kind of set these up and asked the questions. I think John mentioned this, but there are sort of 3 inputs into this. Our focus groups that we met with over the first couple weeks of March, and then Paul Fallon's going to present 2 different surveys, and they were all, working with the same considerations. Questions are asked a little differently because of the different ways in which the input was being shared out, but the considerations are all the same. So the first consideration posed a question for folks about, should we really focus on impacting the fewest amount of students now, or should we account for that future growth and really plan out for the district? So again, if you account for future growth using higher range projections, the farthest out projected year, and we have 10-year projections out through 2035, and there's a range within that. Again, that affects more students now potentially, but sets up the district to minimize future redistricting. Or should we really just focus on minimizing the fewest students now that we need to achieve what we need to do, but again, might need to redistrict sooner, in as soon as 5 years. So that was set up for folks, and then they were asked to choose, in this case, A or B, which they felt better would position the district for success in the future. So this consideration was about kind of who moves and when. So this was about whether we would allow grandfathering in over time of students. So kids who are already in high school would have a choice on whether to move to their newly assigned school or stay in the current one. And then, or do we move students all at one time? Again, this we were saying at the start of the 27-28 school year, including freshmen, sophomores, and juniors. Seniors would stay in this scenario. And there's some efficiencies for administration and staff that we sort of highlighted there. But again, this is more about who's moving and when it happens. So again, we posed this and then asked folks for feedback on which one they thought was a better choice and why. Okay, this was about how comprehensive we look at the boundaries. So what we were trying to share here was, do we look at all the boundaries? Do we potentially affect all the schools? Again, could be like a domino effect type of thing, or just really relook at all the boundaries. At this point, would you draw the high school boundaries the way they are if you were to do it today, knowing how it's grown and how it's going to continue to grow, the district? So there was this comprehensive, look at all the boundaries and really look at it, look at those impacts. Or are we just trying to be more surgical, impact the fewer amount of students to achieve the goal that we need to achieve, which might mean moving kids from where the growth is happening to where there is capacity. So again, 2 different ideas on how this could go. This consideration was about the feeder patterns. So this was about the feeder patterns and the middle school boundaries. So we wanted to understand from folks, should we keep the feeder patterns the same? We know there's been some redistricting at the middle school level recently. And so was there an appetite within the community to sort of relook at that? Or should we just keep those feeder patterns the same? So this one sets up keeping those feeder patterns the same or making changes to create better flow for high school. Again, some spot redistricting at the middle school level could achieve that better flow for new high school boundaries and give some more flexibility when you're thinking about the map. Or do we really want to keep those current feeder patterns together in the same way it's been? And then this final one was not posed as sort of a or B or this or that, but it was more of a multiple choice, and we were just trying to understand this term proximity and how maybe we should think about that, because there are different ways to think about proximity, and we teed up a few things here. A radius drawn around a school building kind of as the bird flies. Travel time, we said driving time, but we kind of clarified that as travel time, whether you're walking, biking, busing, driving in a car to a school building, or distance mileage to a school, which we know those aren't always the same due to the route you might have to take, the traffic, crossing over a major intersection or things like that. Or we asked folks if there was another way to think about it, they could use their worksheet to share that other option as well. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Are there any questions on kind of the setup and the questions that were asked during the focus groups before I move on to sharing the input we received? All right. So this is small, sorry for on the screen there. But also I just wanted to make a note that we purposely just shared these as A or B options, and there was sort of obviously something went first and something came second. For the feedback, I moved everything to the left side that got a higher percentage of feedback. So they're not necessarily in the same order. I'm not trying to trick anyone. I just wanted to make it easy to read the chart here. So if you were tracking along about what was what, I've just put all of the considerations that got the higher percentage of support on the left side of that table. So for the first consideration about accounting for future growth, or really just trying to impact the fewest amount of students now, did get 81% to account for that future growth now. So people do want to take that long-term look. Also allow grandfathering in over time, got 62% as well. Again, wanting those students to have a choice and not doing it all at one time. This third one did not, while there is obviously something highlighted because there is something that got more support, they're very close. You can see at 52% and 48%. So the community is, I think, fairly split on how comprehensively we should look at the boundaries. Do we really involve all the schools, really, like, I wouldn't say start over, but really look at those and be free to kind of adjust as we, or create them as we need to, or are we trying, again, to be more surgical? So you can see that one was a little closer. And then make changes to create better flow for the high school. So people were open to some spot redistricting at the middle school in order to keep those feeder patterns and keep that kind of better flow for those new high school boundaries at 83%. Around the proximity question, the drive time or travel time was highest at 44%. You can see distance mileage at 23%, closely followed by other, which I'm going to unpack this in a second, at 20%. And we have some thoughts from folks on that, mostly about probably thinking through multiple ways of thinking about proximity. There's probably not one way, but thinking about it in multiple ways. Okay, so I'm going to share some qualitative feedback now. So these were the sentiments that came from a summary of sentiments that came from the why question. So again, why do people choose account for future growth or impact fewer students now? And so you can see up here some of the ideas that were shared. So I think there is a desire to avoid repeating this process in 5 years. So people, did want to take that long-term look, because redistricting is emotionally exhausting and costly process. So trying to set the district up for that longer time. And then I think there were some perceptions that the past, shorter-term fixes were maybe not as effective as just really taking that longer-term look. There was a few folks who asked about the confidence or accuracy of the long-term projections, and I did share a few things with those groups about some of the at least last 3 years at the high school level. The projections and the enrollment did align pretty well. So again, no one has a crystal ball. It's still a projection, but felt pretty good about the data that they were getting, and knowing that where the growth is coming and that there is more growth in the school district boundary. And so you can see there are a few other bullet points on that one as well. So this was about the students, like who moves and when. So again, the grandfathering in, allowing that sort of choice, having a slower sort of transition period for the redistricting to happen, was at 62%. And I think a lot of those comments came from just a concern for student mental health and well-being, and just the disruption that it can cause to students' academic and extracurricular plans, again, if they're working towards something at their current school, leadership positions and such, giving that sense of control a little bit back to the families on how that would roll out. We also clarified for folks that, transportation would not be provided for anyone who would be outside of their attendance boundary if they chose to stay in their current school. They'd have to get themselves there. There seemed to be an understanding of that and acknowledgement of that. Moving students all at one time, there was acknowledgement that does reduce strain on administrative resources to kind of track that and do that kind of manually. But again, I think there was can cause some complications for families that might have siblings in different high schools. So there was a few bullets there as well. Okay, so this consideration 3 was about how comprehensively we look at those boundaries. Are we really going to be more surgical? So again, these are pretty close, 52% to 48%. But again, you can see some of the bullets there really help all 3 schools share the burden, this idea of one Dublin, really like produce that better, longer lasting boundaries if we just kind of take that comprehensive look now. There are folks that believe that since the growth is in Jerome should, be more in the mix. And there were some frustrations, I think, about moving students in sort of that central area of Kaufman, potentially, when they're not in the growing area. Surgical move is considered simpler, more cost-effective to some folks. And so, again, thinking about how you're being surgical obviously will be really important here. This consideration, again, is about the feeder patterns from the middle school. So again, people were, 83% pretty open to re-looking at those if it meant a better, flow up to the high school. I think there's some pre-existing frustrations with the current middle school feeder patterns. We know that was done recently. But again, I think there's just this desire to really try to keep the cohorts together, K through 12, as much as possible for obviously those friend groups and things that they are doing along the way. And so again, generally people were okay with looking at middle school and even down to elementary school potentially if that meant getting that best feeder pattern and best flow up into the high school. There were people who felt, though, on the flip side there that, again, the middle school was redistricted recently, and so not to have to do that so soon and maybe disrupt students. The timing, though, wouldn't really affect any students that were affected of the current middle school boundary, just because of when the timing is this, they'll have matriculated out of middle school, so it won't hit the same students twice, but there was some concerns about that. And then this final consideration, again, was about the idea of proximity and how do we define that and how do we use that in this work. And so the driving time to a school was chosen as one of and again, the consideration of walking and biking was pretty clearly heard about being prioritized. People also acknowledged that the geography of Dublin makes the mileage misleading sometimes due to infrastructure crossing river or 270 or roundabouts or other major roadways or intersections. And drive time is oftentimes how families think about their commute, not so much about the mileage. And obviously, safety, student safety and driver safety, shorter drive times support that. And then folks who picked the distance mileage, again, felt like maybe it was an objective or more fair metric, and it's less variable than drive time. On the other points, a number of people commented that probably a combination of all 3 metrics in some way may be practical than any one. Again, a desire for that safety, really thinking about the safety as a primary consideration with high traffic areas and roundabouts and stuff. And ensuring, again, that students who walk or bike to school can still do so, even if the boundaries shift. Natural boundaries and infrastructure should be accounted for as well, bridges, neighborhoods, things like that. Some folks who picked the radius thought it was the most intuitive, helps reinforce the neighborhood connections, but again, that was the lowest sort of supported way to think about proximity. And then finally, we asked them to prioritize, and we know this was hard because they're all important considerations, and while we allowed them to sort of, look and think about each one and choose, we then forced them to put them all back in the hopper and really force them to say, what is the most important to you, or what do you think best positions the district for future success? And so planning for the future growth at 52% was the one that kind of rose up. And then the one about the least important consideration was about keeping those feeder patterns the same. Again, we saw a lot of support for being able to change those feeder patterns or think about those feeder patterns differently to create that better flow for high school. Okay, that's all I had. I guess any questions for me before I turn it over to Paul, who's going to share about the survey work he did?
I have a few questions. Do you have numbers on how many people were in the focus groups, just so that...
like total?
Yes, like
Yeah,
total, like what the... So that we can compare that to like the survey.
Yeah.
How many people?
There was, I think 100, I'm looking over at Bailey, 153, I think, total participants. Yeah, 153.
Do you have those broken down by which groups, like how many were in each group?
Yes. Yes, we have it, yeah. Not off the top of my head, but
Right,
we have
no,
it
no,
in a
no.
spreadsheet of like who was in, you know, how many people came to each one. They varied between about, I'm trying to think, 3 to 4 up to about 10. Like 10 was our maximum, but they kind of varied, but depending on how many people actually were able to make the meeting, of course.
Do you know how many people RSVP'd saying they were going to come, but then did not attend?
We do. I will say that we didn't have, overall, there weren't a lot of no-shows. And the people who couldn't make it last minute due to something happening, being sick or something, did tell us that morning. So we didn't have a ton of people who RSVP'd and then didn't show up. It was not really an issue this round. Mhm.
And just to clarify, the 153,
Okay. I'm sorry, I have a correction. 177 focus group, not 153.
okay,
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, 177 RSVP'd. Okay, sorry. Thank you.
177 RSVP'd.
Yeah.
And
And 153 came.
153
Yeah.
came. Okay.
Thank you. I was like, I'm really off.
Tiffany, sorry, did you have more questions that you wanted to?
You can go ahead.
Okay. I just had a question about how the questions were actually compiled. Like, how did you think of these? Who did you work with to come up with these specific questions?
Yes, so we, based on the input that you all shared at the February retreat, we went through and kind of looked at, there was a lot of good thoughts out there, but not everything that could kind of like be an input into a map, you know? So we tried to think about the things that actually could be, and also sorted into those board policy factors. So we decided that there was, you know, again, those 5 different kind of areas we should focus on, and then we came up with sort of how to ask the question based on these choices rather than just getting feedback on all the different factors or all the different considerations, but really posing them that way in order to get folks to understand that there are, you know, there's choices. You can't have this and have that. So there's a lot of work in kind of refining, you know, those considerations so they'd be easy for folks to understand and be able to kind of make those choices, so pairing them together. But we've started with the input from the board, from the retreat, and then working with administration to kind of refine that down. But we came up with sort of the facilitation technique and the way we ask the questions. Yeah.
One more, sorry, follow-up. Would you expect, I know we talked about the certain criteria within that meeting. Would you expect that all the questions hit on maybe those top criteria, or would we have separate criteria that we're looking at as a board? So I guess, you know, I'm thinking of,
Yeah.
that was pretty comprehensive that we did
Yeah.
in the meeting. Would you expect that all those questions hit on all that criteria?
Yeah, I feel like it hit on most of the things that, again, that can contribute into, like if you're thinking about what goes into the RFP for the map maker, like their parameters, like you can look at the middle school boundaries if you need to, right? We want to take the projections that are the longest year, you know, our 2035 projections and the highest range. So again, thinking about those inputs, I do think that we've got those 5 considerations really cover the meat of what those ideas were shared and what can kind of go into that map input, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I'll probably circle back after the
Yeah,
foul.
that's
and then-
fine.
okay.
And just so I'm clear, so the additional feedback was taken through the survey form, or was that through discussion in the focus
It was on a worksheet. Yeah, that's a good question. So, you know, these were set up to be about 45, 50 minutes. And again, we invited up to 10 to come to each of we tried to fill them up to 10 if we could. Again, they were different sizes depending on who could make it. But again, we were trying to make sure that everyone had a chance to share, even in 45 minutes if you're doing everything through discussion. And again, not everybody feels comfortable sharing, so we really wanted to make it a safe space. So we used a live polling software, so people were chiming in on their phones. We were just getting it into the back end of the into a spreadsheet, so that would build quickly for us to look at. And then everyone had a worksheet, just, old-fashioned style, I guess, worksheet there, where they could then provide their additional feedback on the why they chose. And then they circled A or B for that, so we knew which comment their comment supported, or which choice their comment supported. So we didn't have a ton of, most of the discussion was around clarifying for folks if they needed to understand something more in order to, again, give their best input. It really wasn't the format for campaigning or debating, or, it was really like, we want to hear from you and your thoughts. And so while we're doing it in a group setting, it was really kind of individual feedback.
Another question. You mentioned that the students was one of your favorite groups, and they had really good feedback. Can you share some of their specific feedback to you?
Yeah. So they were, let's see, they were like, yeah, we got to do this right. Really want that, kind of taking that long-term effect. Their feedback mirrored the overall feedback pretty well. I'm looking at Bailey here if I can. She's been in the spreadsheet a lot more than I have. But they also felt like the grandfathering in, like as a student, they would want a choice, on that. So that was, again, it kind of followed the overall feedback, but that was something they said. But they asked just really thoughtful questions. They really wanted to understand. And again, these were sophomores, juniors, seniors, so it wasn't going to affect them, but they really cared about, on behalf of their folks coming up behind them, they really cared to understand. But they were pretty kind of matter of fact about it too. They kind of understood that this is where the school district was and this had to be done. And so again, they asked about the projections. They were the first group to ask me about how accurate the projections were, which was interesting that they were thinking about that. Again, if you're going to put your stake into something. So we talked through that a little bit. But yeah, their input pretty much mirrored the overall feedback that we got. Any other questions? Okay, all right. I'm going to turn it over to Paul. He'll come up and share with you the survey input. Yep.
Good evening. My name is Paul Fallon. I'm with Fallon Research and Communications. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be back here. I was pondering this on my way over, but this is now my 23rd year working for the district, and I'm not sure who's been here longer, Mr. Valentine or myself. We'll have to suss that out later. In any event, it's always a pleasure. I'm going to go ahead and present the results of a couple different studies that were conducted simultaneously, and you're going to have to excuse me, but in the interest of time, not everything made it into this presentation. It's just an overview. So if you've got any specific questions about anything that I didn't present this evening, please feel free to contact me at a subsequent point, and I'll be glad to discuss those questions with you. Let me go ahead and jump right in. First and foremost, we did a public study, and that was with 604 adults who are residents of the district. And for 604 responses, we have an overall estimated margin of sampling error of 3.98%. And the surveys and interviews were done during the period of March 9th through March 13th, so this is very recent data. During that same time, we also did a SMS text-to-web study with 500 district parents based on a list that was provided by the school system. And for 500 responses, the overall estimated margin of sampling error is plus or minus 4.02%. These were done during the period of March 9th through March 10th, so this is also very recent data. A couple things I want to point out are, first and foremost, the results are presented in a slightly different order than the questions appeared, and that was due to the fact that we're taking two separate studies and compiling them and synthesizing them into one presentation. I also want to point out, too, that due to computational rounding, not all the results are going to add up to 100%. One of the first questions we asked on the public study is, generally speaking, this time, would you say you're satisfied or dissatisfied with the Dublin City School District? At the time of the study, 63% of the members of the public were satisfied 19% were dissatisfied, and 18% were unsure. Looking at the horizontal bar chart on the right-hand side of the screen, among parents, that is people from the public study who indicated they had children enrolled in the district, 64% were satisfied compared to 64% of non-parents. Among Delaware County residents, 55% were satisfied, got up to 65% for Franklin County, and it was 60% in Union County. And also, when we asked the same question in 2024, the level of satisfaction was 74%. So as you can see, at this time, when you subtract the number of percentage of respondents who are dissatisfied, the net satisfaction is 44% compared to 63% in 2024. So there's obviously a little bit of restlessness and discord, perhaps, that has affected that. We also programmed the computers so those respondents who indicated that they were dissatisfied were asked in an open-ended format, what is the biggest reason you're dissatisfied with the Dublin City School District? And that was 116 respondents. And as you can see, taxes are too high was number one. And actually, when we took all the responses and analyzed the words and took out all the common words like schools and all the prepositions and just looked at the content words, the word tax, taxes, or taxed appeared 34 times in the verbatim responses. On the second plateau, money not being spent or managed properly was at 17%. 16% alluded to redistricting. 14% talked about education or subject matter. On the third plateau, 8% were unhappy with district leadership. 6% cited overcrowding, and 5% talked about the rate of growth or housing growth. Another 12% gave other miscellaneous responses, and 1% were unsure. Now, to give you a little flavor for what people said, I want to present a couple of the verbatim responses to you. One person said, the many levies that have passed recently and raised property taxes. And that was what that person indicated was the reason for his or her dissatisfaction. Another respondent said, money spent should be more focused on education and teachers and less on administration and adding and redoing all the athletic facilities. Another respondent said, changes to the school district which are based in politics and not the well-being of children. Now, we also looked at some key performance measures. These are standard benchmarks that we've been testing for 23 years now, by and large. And for example, we asked, how would you rate the quality of education being provided by the Dublin City School District? As you can see, and I apologize for the small print here, but I put a lot on these slides. 80% said very good or good. Now, when we asked among parents, that was 85%. Among non-parents, it was 79%. And when we asked the same question in 2024, it was 86%. So it's a little bit different, but within the same decile. And when the level of performance rating, the performance rating is that high, that's very reassuring. We also asked about the job being done by classroom teachers. 73% overall said very good or good. Looking at the right-hand side of the screen, 79% of parents said very good or good, compared to 69% of non-parents. When we asked the same question in 2024, 78% said very good or good. Again, within that same decile, a high level of consistency. Lastly, and this was a bit of a change, we asked, how would you rate the job the district does spending its money and managing its finances? Just 38% said very good or good. And as you can see from the right-hand side of the screen, the results among parents and non-parents are almost identical at 39 and 38% respectively, but this is a measure that's dropped a bit. It was 49% in 2024. So this was one of the changes that we observed since the last public study was done. We also looked at comparing schools by asking, do you think that the quality of education is generally about the same throughout all the schools within the Dublin City School District, or differs greatly from school to school? As you can see in the most recent survey, 43% said they're generally about the same, 34% said they differ from school to school, and 23% were unsure. When we asked the same question in 2024, it was a little bit different. At that time, 48% said they're generally about the same, a plurality bordering on a near majority. Just 28% said they differ, and 24% were unsure. And I have a feeling that the discussion over the course of the last few months may have crystallized people's views and forced them to consider the school district qualitatively on an individual level. We also asked a similar question on a parent survey, but we did something a little different. We used what's known as split sample testing. We randomly assigned respondents in the parent survey to one of two versions. For example, in version A, we asked, do you think that the quality of education is generally about the same throughout all the schools within the Dublin City School District, or differs greatly from school to school? An identical question from the one on the public survey. And as you can see, the results are pretty similar. 41% said generally about the same, 34% say it differs from school to school, and 25% were unsure. The other half of the respondents, however, were asked almost an identical question, but instead of asking about the schools, we asked about all the high schools within the Dublin City School District. As you can see, the numbers are almost identical. 41% said that high schools are about the same, 30% say they differ greatly from high school to high school, and 29% were unsure. And when we compared the results using chi-square testing, there was an unacceptably high probability that those differences are due to chance. So the minimal differences are just a result of the effect of using random sampling. I also want to point out, too, that there was a 9% differential in 2026 between the amount of people saying generally about the same compared with those saying it differs greatly from school to school, but it was 20% in 2024. Again, so that's a notable difference as well. We also asked about redistricting. For example, we asked, how closely have you been following news and information about the redistricting student assignment of the Dublin City School District high schools? On the public study, overall, 34% say they've been following it very closely. But as you can see below that, among parents, 52% say they've been following it very closely, compared to just 22% of non-parents. Also, in the parent study, 52% said they've been following it very closely. Interestingly, in Delaware County, it got up to 74%. Also want to point out, too, if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, we asked another question. How important is it to you? And this is something we always try to quantify using a scalar question. And the reason that we want to look at intensity is because the more strongly people feel about something, the more likely they are to act on that sentiment, and the less likely they are to change their minds. And as you can see, 61% of parents said this is a very important matter to them. But it was only 24% for non-parents. It's almost like a Dickensian tale of two cities here in terms of the issue salience and importance that exists in the district. We also asked, generally speaking, do you agree or disagree that the school district has done a good job trying to inform parents and the public about its enrollment growth and building capacity challenges? 45% agreed, 32% disagreed, and 23% were unsure overall. Among parents, 42% agreed, 42% disagreed, a statistical jump ball, and 16% were unsure. Slightly different story for non-parents. 48% agreed, almost a majority. 24% disagreed, and 28% were unsure. So while those are not substantial differences, they're notable ones nevertheless. We also asked on the survey a very similar question. Generally speaking, do you agree or disagree that the school district has done a good job trying to inform parents about its enrollment growth and building capacity challenges? In that study, 60% agreed, 28% disagreed, and 12% were unsure. And I noted that that was probably the biggest difference in terms of the effect of using mediums. The public survey was done through a combination of telephone interviews and SMS text-to-web surveys, whereas the parent study was done using just SMS text-to-web surveys. So that may be an artifact of mode differences. We also asked, generally speaking, do you agree or disagree that the school district has done a good job creating opportunities for parents and the public to give feedback about future high school assignment plans? 44% agreed, 28% disagreed, and 28% were unsure. Among parents, 40% agreed, but 41%, a narrow plurality, disagreed, 19% were unsure. Slightly different story with non-parents, 46% agreed, and while 20% disagreed, 34% were unsure. This is probably a reflection of the fact that non-parents are not following this matter as closely, as we saw in some of the previous data. We also asked in the parent study, generally speaking, do you agree or disagree that the district has done a good job creating opportunities for parents to give feedback about future high school assignment plans? In that survey, 51% agreed, 31% disagreed, and 18% were unsure. Looking at attendance boundaries, and this was from the parent study exclusively, as district leaders are making decisions about future attendance boundaries for assigning students to high schools, which should be the most important factor in deciding how students will be affected. As you can see, 32% say the district should strive to spread out the impact of school reassignment. 54%, a statistical majority, said the district should strive to minimize impact by reassigning as few students as possible, and 14% were unsure. And I want to note there were big differences by county. In Delaware County, 58% say the district should strive to minimize impact, compared to 48% in Franklin County, which was a plurality but not a majority, and in Union County, a whopping 72% seemingly bristled at the notion of impact and prefer for the district to strive to minimize it. We also asked, do you think it is possible to meet the school system's future enrollment growth and school capacity needs without constructing another high school building somewhere in the district? This was interesting. 29% said yes, it is possible to meet needs without another building. 42%, a plurality but far from a majority, say it's not possible, and another 29% were unsure. I was a little bit surprised about this, given all the dialogue that's occurred over the last few months. Typically, as the public becomes attuned to such matters, they start to engage in the behavior of opinion formation, but that doesn't seem to happen here quite as much, or perhaps the information has been confusing and hasn't allowed them to really assess it enough to have developed preferences. Looking at parents, 27% say it's possible, 49%, a near majority, say it's not, 24% were unsure. Among non-parents, 29% say it's possible, 38% say it's not possible, but 33% were unsure. So it was clear as mud there with non-parents. Looking at this same question in 2024, 29% said it's possible, 49% said it's not possible, and 22% were unsure. We also asked, which of the following considerations do you feel is the most essential one for positioning the district for continued success as the community grows? And this was asked only on the parent study, and this is what's known as a forced choice battery, in which the respondents were provided options from which to choose. And as you can see, the most frequently chosen one was to plan now for future growth, so redistricting will serve the district longer. On the second plateau, 20% chose prioritize proximity to growth, 15% chose impact the least number of students overall by moving kids from where growth is happening to where there's capacity. On the third plateau, 8% chose keeping the feeder patterns the same, 6% chose allowing kids to be grandfathered in over time, which means higher costs. 4% chose moving all the kids at the start of the 27-28 school year. 4% chose spreading out redistricting evenly across the district, and 3% chose impacting the least number of students now, even though redistricting will have to be done sooner. So a lot of response options here, so it's not surprising that none of them garnered a majority. Nevertheless, at 32%, it's clear that, as Sarah alluded to earlier, there are a lot of people in the community who have a long-term vision and don't just see this as a one-off, short-term decision. Something that I thought was critically important is over the last year, have you seen or noticed any news, information, or posts about the Dublin schools on the social media accounts of your friends, parents, or others in the community? This was on the public study, and 58% said yes, they had. So among those 58%, respondents were then asked, generally speaking, was most of the information you saw on social media favorable or unfavorable towards the Dublin schools? At the time, and keep in mind this was just done a couple weeks ago, 31% said the information was mostly favorable. 48%, a statistical plurality bordering on a majority, said it was unfavorable. When we asked the same question in 2024, we had 51% penetration, so almost the same, but it was like night and day. 63% said at the time what they were seeing on social media was favorable. 26% said it was unfavorable. So looking back to 2026, net favorability, which is derived by subtracting the unfavorable responses from the favorable ones, resulted in negative 17% favorability compared to 37%. So that's a 54% differential over the course of 2 years. A couple of other notable findings I want to touch on very briefly. First and foremost, 80% of the residents expressed satisfaction with the quality of life in their respective counties. Now, I was telling someone earlier that I just signed a new client today in the 43rd state in which I will be working. And so I feel like I can draw on a vast range of experience to say that that is exceptionally high. You're breathing a lot of rare air in this community, and people don't always feel that way in a lot of the other places that I work. A lot of times I'm 911. I'm the person you call when the building's on fire, but that isn't necessarily the case here. People love this community. Second, 51% of residents reported being frequent users of social media, including 57% of parents, 47% of non-parents, and 41% of seniors 65 plus. This is becoming an increasingly effective way to reach a broad swath of the community. Just a few years ago, there was a dramatic drop-off once you reached about the age of 50, and you just weren't reaching anyone. Now, the penetration is exceptionally high across the board. This is a very effective medium for reaching a lot of people in a very inexpensive manner. Third, 60% of residents said that the rate of housing growth was too fast, including 65% of parents, 71% of Delaware County residents, and 81% of residents in Union County. 80% said over the next few years they think student enrollment at the schools will increase, including 79% of non-parents. Parents and non-parents were very like-minded in this regard. 24% of residents said that overcrowding of the high schools is a very big problem, paradoxically. When you think about the fact that 80% expect a rate of increase, but right now just 24% say that it's a big problem. And what was more interesting in my mind was that it was higher. It was 30% in 2024. So it's actually dropped 6 percentage points. And lastly, 73% of parents say the district should allow students who are already in high school to finish at the high schools at which they're already attending, compared to the alternative, which was moving kids for the 27-28 year. Lastly, one thing I want to touch on before I close and open the floor for questions is that, as you can probably infer, there's some discord and restlessness right now within the district. But I thought it was really impressive that despite that, 80% still think that your most important function is when you're doing well. That's educating children. That does not seem to be affected by what else is happening in the community. And I thought that was both impressive and reassuring. With that, I'd like to open the floor for any questions anyone has.
Paul, so in looking at the unsure, you do this all the time. Are the numbers higher than you would expect? What does unsure, what drives an unsure question or an unsure answer?
That's a good question, and I struggle. It depends on the situation. I think part of it is uncertainty. Part of it is ambivalence. And I think, frankly, there are some people who just are not concerned about the matter. Remember, the lion's share of people in this community don't have kids in school.
I just found it interesting that the unsure were so heavy. I would expect them maybe
they were high. I agree with you.
People generally have strong opinions.
Yeah.
And so to be unsure makes me wonder what is making that answer come out.
I always say that a good survey can raise as many questions as it answers, and that there were certainly some questions raised by this.
One follow-up, sorry, board members. So for our next steps, would we want to do something that would help raise the surety in the ways in which the questions are asked, just so that people don't feel like they're ambivalent, or this is normal? In all of the experience you have, this is very normal.
I say it's normal. The level of uncertainty is a little bit high in some areas, but some of the subject matter is kind of esoteric, especially if you don't have kids enrolled in school.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you for all of that. It's very helpful to see, especially comparing where we are now to past surveys. I think it really shows where future education, community education, can focus. But I do have a question, if you could just speak to it, because someone asked me about it. If a member of the community received a text message, I think parent, but I assume community member as well, if they received an invitation to complete the survey and then they did not do that in time, and it said, we've already reached the number of participants, can you explain that and how that works, and the level of certainty and just why they might receive that type of message and what it means?
I assume you're referring to the SMS text-to-web survey that was done among parents.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, we left that open for 48 hours. And the reason that we wanted to close it down is because that's the typical time frame that we use for such studies. And the longer they're up or accessing data, the more likely that there are going to be efforts to try and, in some way, stuff the ballot box.
Thank you.
Mr. Fallon, can you talk a little bit more about that stuffing the ballot box? Because I know you have ways to make sure that that doesn't happen. Can you just clarify for the community so they know that that was not able to happen?
Well, we had, I'll be honest with you, more than a few instances of people taking the survey more than once. And we also had people from outside the sample pool who did the survey, presumably because it was shared with someone else who they believed was like-minded. And the way the program's set up, we let them take the survey, but the results are not tabulated to prevent anyone from trying to disproportionately influence the outcome of the results. That's not unique to the Dublin City School District, by the way. That happens fairly often.
Just because I know that some people in the community obviously received this survey, you also have demographic that you did not present. And can you explain why you surveyed demographics such as race when it cannot be used for redistricting, just so everybody's aware why that was in the survey, even though we are not looking at that?
Oh, that's a great question. I rarely get that one. To calibrate the survey data to make sure that the results are a reflection of the community we're studying. We use post-hoc stratification and weighting to make sure each subgroup is represented in proportion to its percentage of the population. So it's essentially used for calibration.
Okay, I have a question, just quickly. First, yes, thank you. I think that between the focus groups in this, there are some patterns and trends that we see. I think that's for sure very helpful. One of the main criteria that I had wasn't in any of these questions, and so I just wanted to point out here,
when you had mentioned the quality of education being provided in Dublin, it is very high. I think people think, you know, we do a good job in Dublin. People move here for the schools. So that 85%, I believe, is reflective of how people feel.
I would add, I don't mean to interrupt,
no,
but I would
please.
add, too, that it's been consistently high.
Right.
And I'm talking about a couple decades here.
That's good. I think that is a reflection of the schools and how people feel when they want to move into the schools, which is why we're seeing this growth, right? So there was a question, though, that said quality of education across the schools, how it differs across the schools and how people feel about that. So we did not have the majority thinking that they were satisfied across the schools. 24 to 29% were unsure, and then 34% said that it differs from school to school.
Right, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were dissatisfied.
Right, right.
It's just there wasn't the level of consistency that they had observed.
For sure. I think, you know, to your point, I think overall people do feel that the schools are good here. But maybe there is some thinking that some schools are different than others, which, again, I think is reflective in some of the things that we're hearing, right? So I think our ultimate goal is to make sure that the schools are good across the board. I know that when we did our retreat, we talked about using academic outcomes as one of the criteria, and I didn't see that touched upon here. And I think when we're talking about the schools, it is important to look at the academic piece of that. And so I think that is one thing that we did not capture here. If we think about how we are going to balance the schools and we look at academics in terms of, I guess, the safety piece, obviously is another. When you start weighing those, right, you want to make sure you're taking into the safety piece. You're not going to be pulling people from one end to the other. That doesn't make sense. You don't want, you know, anything to happen. I think we see that here, that safety is important. And, you know, the feeder patterns, and you start taking all of that into account, but I just didn't see the academic piece. And so I kind of want to bring that to the board as what their thoughts are, and then also your thoughts as well.
I would just mention that this is a community-wide survey, and this is among rank-and-file residents, most of whom do not have the kind of knowledge and expertise that you have, many of whom who don't have children in schools. So this is just about perceptions. It's not an necessarily accurate indication of differences that exist between the schools, but just how people think of them. So that's
Definitely.
important to keep in mind.
So from the board's perspective, do we feel that the survey is encompassing of all the criteria that we would possibly consider? I guess that's kind of my question. Do we feel that anything is absent from the survey as far as the criteria that we would then consider in redistricting?
To go to what Paul just said, I don't know how you would get that granular in the survey to achieve the end that I think you're trying to get to. I don't know if there is a better tool within this process, whether that comes from the public and then whatever we do with this next stage on the public survey.
That's what I'm wondering, like, is there something that we want to include maybe in the next step, or is that something that we're going to consider just from data that we pull?
What are you trying to get at with it?
The academic outcomes. Like, if we talked about, you know, when we did the retreat, we talked about, you know, maybe MAP testing, we talked about star rating, we talked about, you know, kind of everything that is making up the school academically, that we would consider balancing that.
What is the question that you would want parents or community members to answer surrounding that data?
No, I'm trying to, more for the public, say, is this all encompassing of the criteria? So if we add that criteria later, is that something that we're okay with doing? I want to just make sure we're transparent about all of the criteria we're going to include.
I guess just to jump back in, I thought that when we had that discussion, it tilted more towards opportunity than outcome.
Correct, yes, even opportunity. So I don't feel like that was even talked about, even in the survey. So any of those that go with the academic piece, opportunities across each school, Do we feel that that's something we want to know or something that we will consider?
I think that goes into the opportunities comes when you balance the high schools out with the number of students. That's where the opportunity comes in. So when you're looking at the research, what he did, and what Planning Next did, you're looking at, do we move them all at once? That question, or do we do it grade by grade? That comes into the academic piece of outcomes, because that's what we were focusing on with number of classes that are offered, academic clubs, other clubs, all of that. That comes with the population. I don't think we were looking at data point outcomes other than just the ability to have the same number of courses. But I do see that there is this notion from the community that things differ greatly from school to school sometimes, and I think that that's something that we need to focus on and communicate, that no, all 3 high schools have the same program of studies, they offer the same classes. The difference comes in is at Jerome right now, because of how they're crowded they are, they might have 10 sections of AP US history, and at Scioto, because they have a smaller population, they might only have 3 sections. And that makes it difficult to schedule if you can't take it during any of those 3 periods. And so that leaves out opportunities for students. So I think that's what we discussed earlier. Are you talking about something else that you want?
Well, I mean, kind of what we had talked about in the retreat, as we listed what was important, I believe that one got 4 dots or whatever, academic outcome, which had like MAP scores, it had ratings, things like that. If that's something we're still going to consider aside from the survey, I just want to be clear on that we're going to look at that in the process.
I still think we need to be careful on how we're labeling this, and I think we all have our own viewpoint, but I think there's a big difference as we talk about this between outcome and opportunity, and I think that's what you were just hitting on, Amy. And I don't know if you're being purposeful on using outcome versus opportunity, but even looking at the numbers, there is a difference in, albeit 4%, as people looked at elementary school, middle school, high school versus specifically high school, there is a difference in what the numbers show in terms of the responses from the public. But to get into outcomes is a very difficult, and I would even, I don't know if dangerous is the best term, but I think that's a difficult thing for us to start to get into in terms of a board. Because if we're going to apply that to outcomes, to high schools as it relates to this discussion, then it shouldn't be applied to middle school, shouldn't be applied to elementary school. And then if we're getting into STARS, if we're getting into map testing, there's variables that are out there that are very difficult for us to create an equal base outcome amongst all of our different schools.
Right. I don't mean to say equal base, it has to be the same across, but a balance, right? And we do use the star rating system to rate our schools. That is something that I believe that we like to, boast about, that we are a higher star rated school district is something that we're proud of. And then same with our testing and all of these things across the board. How do we measure success in our schools if it's not for these measurable goals and outcomes? How are we saying our schools are successful?
I think we're getting into
Mrs. Marple, can I ask you a question, please, so we can clarify a few things? We do not do MAP scores past middle school, correct?
We map test all students K-8. In high school, we map test in some pockets around intervention and tracking, but not across the board.
And do we do STAR testing?
No, there is a STAR ranking system on the state report card. We do.
Yes.
You're
Yes.
referring to the state report card STAR ranking.
Correct, yes.
I think the problem with moving kids based on those rankings is that you're not moving the kids that were tested.
Well, I don't necessarily think, I think that there's again, the criteria, so there's weightages to that. Is that just something that we were going to consider? When we put it on the board, what were we envisioning that was going to encompass?
I think we're not going to come up with the criteria today.
Right.
I think, just taking in this information will inform the criteria that we create when we do make the resolution. I don't think we're, going to be able to operationalize, I think, what you're looking for right now. And I think also we might need more input before we can speak to that more effectively.
Okay, so, if it's something that we can shelve, that's one thing. I just want to make sure if we're going to move forward for the next step, that if we have something that we want to include, we start thinking about where maybe we want to have additional questions or focus, why we have Paul here.
Absolutely. I will tell everybody this, because I did ask before, we are not to make any decisions tonight. We have no actions on the agenda, so no decisions will be made tonight. Mr. Fallon, I do have a question for you. How would you suggest, if we wanted to, that last question where it was the forced, where they had to choose one, if we wanted to get a ranking on that, almost like rank choice, what kind of data would that provide us compared to what this data is?
Well, they were only given the opportunity to choose once. So if you used a ranked choice system where there were a multiplicity of questions with each subsequent one excluding the answer they gave previously, you might find out that there are some, especially in that second tier, that are all grouped together, that might have some differences that weren't obvious, because some of them might be much higher and some of them might be much lower.
Would there be any choices that you would say, if we were going to do that, that we could leave off?
I think that's a matter of preference. There were a few that were in single digits, and in the interest of ease, if we were doing it telephonically, you'd probably want to pare down the question a little bit. That's too long to ask in a telephone survey. So out of necessity, you might want to exclude some of those, but if you were doing it digitally, you don't necessarily have to. But that's, I suppose, a technical answer.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions for Mr. Fallon, or I believe we can move on to our discussion?
Always a pleasure to be back.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Based on the data that we have from both surveys and from the surveys and the Planning Next, it is clear that this community wants us to allow students that once they start in a high school to stay in the high school that they start with. We cannot make a decision tonight, but I would like to know where the board is. Can we get a consensus that that is where we are at, and that might help ease some of our community members? We said we were going to take the community, that this is the whole purpose of this, to listen to them and do what they ask us to do. Some other things are a little bit close, and there's going to be harder decisions to make, but right now, those numbers are fairly clear. Do I have a consensus from the board on that?
Yes.
I know we aren't making any decisions tonight. I think we need to make every effort to go in that direction, short of saying yes 100%. I still would like us, we don't know as we hand this over to somebody what that potentially does in terms of giving us the eventual option of a map, but I do think that that's something that needs to be strongly taken into consideration, and the community as a whole, both parent and non-parent, have spoken to that.
Anybody else?
I agree with that. I think it helps with, I think we also saw that minimal disruption to kids. I mean, I went to 3 different high schools, and it wasn't ideal to have to keep switching. So I think the more we can create some stability for our high schoolers, we should.
I agree as well. I think we know that the sense of belonging drops when kids enter 9th grade. If they are also thinking, well, I'm not going to stay here, that might further contribute to that, and I don't think that's ideal.
Anything else that anybody wants to discuss based on this data and information?
I would say that I think it's important, especially when we talk about the transparency, how we led off this meeting. We're digesting this ourselves in real time.
Right, yeah.
So I think that any lack of questions on our part should not be interpreted as apathetic or mindless by any means. I think that we all are coming from very different perspectives, and that's illustrated through this discussion tonight. And I think that there's going to be more from that, and there's going to be more questions that we all have. I don't have anything specific outside of, I think we're going to be touching base on where we go from here timeline-wise and some of that component to where we are.
In light of Mr. Valentine's comment, and just so that the public is aware, the board got this information from Planning Next as you got it. The board received the top sheet survey information from Mr. Fallon yesterday morning. So they had an opportunity to see that, both this presentation in its entirety, the responses from Planning Next, the Fallon research for both polls will be posted online tomorrow morning so that everyone in the community will have the same information that the board has. And as Mr. Valentine said, still very much digesting this information. We had originally put together a timeline that had a resolution in April. There's not a rush to get to that timeline. When we look at a request for proposal from someone who can draw us a map, we just need to have that by the end of October. I think we've said that it's a fluid timeline. Mrs. Messick, I think that with spring break coming, it would probably be beneficial for the board to prepare questions and for you and I and Mr. Kern and Mrs. De Silva to kind of set up that April 9th board meeting to allow for board questions and input about what's next. We may need an additional meeting in April or May as we prepare for a community-wide voluntary participation instrument. Our partners at Planning Next will help us put that instrument together and make sure that we're using the right questions and framing that in the right way. That, according to our timeline, the virtual community meeting with the survey to follow would be our next step. But I think we can have that conversation at the first board meeting in April, and then have that community meeting sometime mid to late April, and then come back and take our time in getting that survey result and getting that back and allowing you as a board to dive deeper into some of the criteria, and then how do you as a board want to prioritize that criteria.
Does that sound good to everyone? So we might be pushing things back a little bit, but I think it's valuable that we have time to really sit with this information and determine what questions we still have and what questions we still want to hear from the community. So we can really make sure that we are doing this right and doing it for what's best for the students.
Dr. Marshausen, I forget if you covered this in your opening comments, but all of the information this evening in terms of what we saw, as well as the results on the website, all that sort of stuff. Can we touch on that one more time?
Yep, everything that was shared tonight, the verbatim comments for Planning Next, the full Fallon research things, all of those will be posted tomorrow on the website so that everyone can have the same information and everybody's working from the same place.
I do have one question, if I may. I know we were almost done here, but I have a question for Planning Next, if you don't mind.
Yes.
Did you, in the feedback that was generated from the focus group, were there any additional criteria that were volunteered from the public, or anything along those lines that you saw that came up frequently?
Not really, Bailey, I'm looking at you. I don't really think there was anything, I mean, we because of the way we facilitate it, we were really trying to focus people in, and we wanted to hear their whys and behind that. We didn't specifically ask them for additional criteria, and I don't think anything came out through the, kind of qualitative expository answers that led to any of that. We did ask similar questions. Paul presented the satisfaction questions, we asked those same questions as warm up to get people into the poll, and they tracked very similar to what Paul said there. But nobody gave us any additional comments on a criteria or something that they would like to see beyond what we kind of asked them.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If there are no further questions, then we can adjourn the meeting. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Valentine. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. De Silva. Please call the roll.
Mr. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. De Silva?
Yes.
Mrs. McLean?
Yes.
Ms. Seward?
Yes.
And Mrs. Messick?
Yes, the meeting is adjourned.